Well, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me real pleasure to introduce once again the President and CEO of the Council of the Americas, Susan Segal, who will be conducting our next conversation. Susan.
Well, thank you again, Eric. Good morning again. Sorry you get me again right now, but here I am. And it's hard to follow such a great panel, but we've managed to do it. And as you all know, Congress plays a critical role in the U.S. approach to the region. So we've arranged to have one of the true foreign policy experts in the Senate, Bill Hagerty, who will join us to talk about how he and his colleagues in the United States Senate actually view the region. When Senator Hagerty spoke to us last year, I noted that he embodies what the Council of the Americas stands for, bringing expertise of the private sector and government together to strengthen democracy and prosperity. I won't go into detail with his bio because you can all read his bio, but I would like to just highlight his experience and his long-time commitment to public service at every level of government. And Senator Hagerty, that is so hard to find, such a commitment to public service today. So thank you very much, and congratulations. So let's dive right into our discussion. You were lucky enough to travel to Chile, Colombia, and Uruguay just recently.
Yes.
I think I missed you by about a week.
Yes.
What are your takeaways from the trip, and in what areas would you consider the U.S. support to be the most pressing?
One, just to take a quick step back. When I came into the United States Senate a little over 2 years ago, joined the Foreign Relations Committee, I made it an important point to focus on the Western Hemisphere. This is a critical area for America, for our strategic position in the world, and it's an area where I think there's tremendous opportunity. It's also an area where I think you all heard this before, where we are missing opportunities time and again because we could be more present. And one thing that came through to me very clear, Susan, on that trip is that the leader of every country was clear to me that America would be the partner of choice, that we would certainly be the strategic partner, the economic partner of choice. We just need to continue to find opportunities to work together. And the countries there that we visited in Latin America are all trying to work their way out of a very challenging time. We've all suffered through the pandemic. Economic challenges are abundant, frankly, security challenges as well. Crime is up across the way. You think about the destabilization in Venezuela, 7 million people in a diaspora across the continent there that are trying to find their way to different places. It's placing inordinate burdens on our partners in South America. And so what came to me very clearly was that the United States is the partner of choice. We have great opportunities right before us, but we've got to seize on those opportunities. And to the extent we don't, and I think this has become a growing concern here in Washington and throughout Latin America, to the extent that we aren't there, China will be.
And so how can we be there? What can we do to move the agenda forward? Because I agree with your assessment. Latin America wants more investment from the United States, wants more engagement with the United States.
I might take you to a conversation. Again, I was in Chile, Uruguay, and in Colombia. I met with the presidents of each of those countries, but I'll start with Colombia because that was one of the most interesting conversations that I had with President Petro there. We spent a little over 3 hours in that conversation talking about the challenges that Colombia is facing and how to move forward. Most of our conversation focused on rural economic development. And I think a number of you know I'm from Tennessee. What you may not know is that I grew up raising cattle and pigs. We had a small farm. We also had a cash crop on that farm called tobacco. And our state had to transition from that key cash crop to a state that had a different economic engine. We had to create an environment in Tennessee that allowed us to move to a strong manufacturing economy. It didn't happen overnight. But the elements for our success had to do with creating an environment in Tennessee that's conducive to capital investment. And only with capital investment do you see the economic growth and the jobs that come from that I think we would all hope to see throughout the hemisphere. Tennessee has another unique advantage because I think energy security is on the top of everyone's mind. Tennessee has something called the Tennessee Valley Authority. A number of you probably have heard of this. It's the largest utility in America. The Tennessee Valley Authority is a huge source of competitive advantage for our state because we're able to deliver stable, reliable, and affordable energy to manufacturing firms, to industrial firms across the state. That strategy, though, did not happen overnight. The TVA didn't leapfrog to alternative energy.
Sure.
The TVA has an all-of-the-above strategy. And so going back to our example in Colombia, President Petro ran on a green energy platform, and many of the things he says are the things that you'll hear here in Washington as well. But he's got a broad chasm to cover right now. He has plentiful coal and oil in his nation. That's a source of competitive advantage. We should be finding a way to work with Colombia so that they can leverage their competitive advantage. We have technologies that will make the utilization of those natural resources far cleaner than the technologies that might come from, say, China. So an all-of-the-above strategy, I think, can make a real difference. If you look back to my home state of Tennessee, we had rolling blackouts in Tennessee just this winter. We had a very severe bout of cold weather. And Tennessee was able to fire up what they call fossil plants, coal-fired plants, because coal can be stored. And we were able to maintain our competitiveness, we were able to maintain our economy because we had an all-of-the-above strategy. So we had a very interesting conversation about how that would play out. And from a basic economic perspective, the rule of law, creating certainty, and making your nation and your economy attractive to capital investment is a critical ingredient. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be done, and I think the United States can play a great role in that.
And do you think the United States can help stabilize some of the Latin American countries from a rule of law perspective and help guide the kinds of laws that would help create more investment?
I think it's up to us as leaders to try to facilitate that. I think what you're doing right here, conveying this message, is absolutely critical and can be very helpful. The other thing is to look at joint opportunities as a motivator. Right. There's the carrot and the stick approach. And I think that if you look at it from an incentive standpoint, which is the way I look at the world, I'm a businessman my entire career. If you can align incentives, you can achieve the desired result. So if you think about what's happening in Asia right now, many companies are in the process of, quote, de-risking their supply chains, of moving their supply chains out of China. This has been going on since 2017. It's accelerated tremendously through the pandemic because I think many boards of directors realized there was a risk associated with having their supply chains spread all over the world, and particularly to have them spread through countries that may not have our best interests at heart. So there's a process right now underway of reshoring industry back to America. We are the largest market in the world. Companies are bringing their product lines, they're bringing supply chains back to America. But to the extent that those supply chains aren't coming back to America, wouldn't we rather have them in this hemisphere? Wouldn't we rather nearshore them? I use the term friendshoring, but finding ways to work together to bring those supply chains closer to home.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's key. And the United States has trade agreements with a number of countries in Latin America, but there are countries that they don't have agreements with. And so the big elephant in the room is how can, if we bring all of these, we try to nearshore, friendshore, as you say, great comment, how do we then get the product into the United States? How can a product made in Brazil have access to the United States, or made in Argentina have access to the United States?
Well, it has to go both ways. The theme has to be reciprocity. And I am fortunate to have been at the point of the spear in terms of setting the groundwork and being a part of the negotiating team for the last free trade agreement that the United States did. That was the U.S.-Japan free trade agreement. Embedded in that also is a very high stakes, a very high standard, I should say, digital trade agreement.
Okay.
It took 2 years to get that done and a great deal of work. These are not easy to do, but the result of the free trade agreement that we struck with Japan opens the Japanese market to American goods as well as opening our market. It facilitates the greater free flow of trade. If you look at the impact of the trade agreements that we have in place. Take Chile, for example. In the year 2000, we opened a free trade agreement with Chile. Our volume of trade with Chile, both ways, has quadrupled in the 20 years from 2000 to 2020. That's good for both of our nations.
Absolutely.
And I think the closer we bring our economic ties, the stronger our strategic ties will be as well.
So you mentioned China. And China, as you know, is all over the region. They're investing, they are lending money. Just last week, the Argentines had to use the swap line, as we just discussed in the previous panel. How do we combat that? What do you think about that? What are the thoughts on the Hill about China's invasion of our hemisphere?
As you rightly note, Susan, China's been very aggressive on every front. And they look at every element of competition, whether it's military competition, diplomatic competition, if you think about multilateral organizations where China is dramatically stepping up their presence and their numbers, but also economic competition has gone on for a very long time. And ever since China's accession to the WTO back in 2001, what we've seen is a very aggressive posture where we've had intellectual property theft that's been rampant. As a business person, I've suffered from this. We've had to compete against champion industries that emanate from China that have massive government subsidies. And if you try to do business in China, you'll find a very different set of rules than the rules associated with doing business in other parts of the world. So we have to acknowledge the fact that China behaves in a predatory fashion. What China has done, what the CCP has done, I should say, is they've looked at this region from a very strategic standpoint. You take a country like Chile with its lithium reserves. You take Argentina, Bolivia, the triangle there. They're very focused on a presence there. They're looking at infrastructure like ports that could have a dual use at some point in time. So I think that as we talk with our neighbors in Latin America, we need to point out some very obvious facts, and that is that when China makes these investments, a number of things tend to be true. One, they'll push very hard to lower the standards so that their companies can come in and compete, because they can't compete against American companies or other companies if you accommodate the highest industrial standards. They'll push to lower the standards. The product that will be delivered, in all likelihood, will not be the same quality as we might be able to deliver. Debt is a big component of the strategy as well. Some call it debt trap diplomacy. I think one of the greatest examples of this is what happened in Sri Lanka. The project there, a deep water port, hard to imagine that the demand actually justified this, but they were able to persuade the government there in Colombo to build a deep water port in Sri Lanka. Before it was done, it was foreclosed upon. Now Chinese have spoken at the port. They operate under Chinese law. It's a deep water port on one of the busiest sea lanes in the world. I call that debt trap diplomacy. I think that's a real challenge. And I think countries in Latin America are looking at this very carefully, but at the same time, we've got to wake up to the opportunity. A number of you probably know our former Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers. He made a comment just a few weeks ago that he was speaking with a leader in Latin America who said to him this: we talk with China, they deliver an airport. We talk with America, they give us a lecture. We need to be in the game. And I talked with Scott Nathan, who runs our Development Finance Corporation, about Uruguay. I think there's great potential in Uruguay. But Uruguay is a medium-income country. So our tool set does not allow us to engage in infrastructure financing. I talked with the president of Uruguay. He'd love to be our partner. He is our partner in a lot of respects. But we're not able to play at the same table because our toolkit doesn't allow us. So I left that meeting with the president of Uruguay thinking we've got to find ways to adjust, to become more flexible, and find ways to really participate in the great infrastructure development opportunities that exist throughout Latin America.
But let's go back to Uruguay, because we were just discussing that Uruguay is a country that wants to export to the United States, wants a really strong relationship with the United States, and they can't get their meat or any other product into our country, and so they're exporting to China. Isn't that something that we could try to work on? More access to our markets, more trade as a means of providing resources?
I think it absolutely is, but trade is something that's got to be a two-way street. It has to be on a reciprocal basis. What I do not want to see happen is what happened after World War II. And a lot of you recall this. After World War II, the United States made its markets open to countries in Europe, to Japan, for example, because they'd been devastated by the war. We wanted to encourage them to trade with us as opposed to turning towards socialism and communism. But we should have time limited those deals, or we should have made them such that once a country becomes a developed economy, we'd find ourselves in reciprocal trade terms. Where we are today, the United States has the lowest trade-weighted tariffs in the world. We have a very open market. I want to encourage our partners to have open markets as well, because it's two-way trade that causes the relationship to thrive. And to the extent we can find those opportunities, and I'm certain we can.
Yes, particularly in a country like Uruguay.
Exactly. We need to be focused on that.
We totally agree with that, and we'd like to see more focus on that. It would be, we have 5 minutes left, and I would not be responsible if I didn't ask you, you mentioned Venezuela, but what do you believe the United States policy should be towards the ongoing political and economic crisis in Venezuela at this point?
Venezuela is destabilizing the entire region. Everybody in this room knows this. As I said, there's a 7 million person diaspora. It's growing by the day. We have sanctions in place. We need to enforce those sanctions and only release those sanctions as we see real, tangible steps toward democracy. I think it's foolish to go in and just step back to release sanctions, to release all of our leverage without being very certain that we're going to get the response that we need. So I think we need to be dealing with Venezuela very carefully, very firmly, and utilize the leverage that has been put in place to achieve real results in terms of delivering progress toward a democratic government there.
Thank you. Final question, or maybe final question. We just in the previous panel talked about how Latin America is part of the solution. Renewable energy, food, minerals, energy security. We talk a lot about that today, right here in our own hemisphere. How can we better leverage that and make that known that Latin America isn't just a problem to the United States, it's part of the solution?
I might take you back to to when I first arrived at the United States Senate in the spring of 2021. I actually took the first congressional delegation trip for the United States Senate that happened post-pandemic. Where did I go? Guatemala and Mexico. I met with the president of Guatemala there, President Giammattei, for about an hour and a half. We talked about his plan to try to help improve the situation in Guatemala. He's very frustrated by our policies at the border because it's causing a tremendous amount of national security challenges for him. People are moving through his country, he doesn't know who they are, and he's losing people to the cartels who are actively marketing and pulling nuclear families apart. But when we got around to talking about the economy, it turns out that they'd hired McKinsey & Company to come in and create a strategy for Guatemala. This is interesting. I'd love to see the McKinsey strategy. So the next day, the business community met, the equivalent of our U.S. Chamber of Commerce, met, and they presented the strategy to me that McKinsey had laid out to help them. It was an economic empowerment strategy. And what it looked for were ways precisely to partner and the different levers that could be used, whether it's adjusting definitions in some of the trade agreements, improving some of the structural impediments to trade, but also taking advantage of the inherent advantages that existed there in Guatemala in terms of human resources, natural resources, and where they might find alliance and partnership with America. I was very encouraged by that. In fact, I encouraged them to come here. We held a meeting up here after that. We need to keep finding ways to cooperate and collaborate. When I met with the president of Colombia very recently, I suggested to him to build a plan that everybody buys into, and we can work together to execute it. So I think that we have an opportunity right before us. It's going to require coordination and planning to get there. But I think the business community can be deeply involved in this. And again, I'll come back to the very basic tenet. Our economic strength and our economic ties are going to support our national security ties.
Well, I mean, we all here believe that the path forward is through through public-private partnerships and more engagement and more dialogue. Do you see the same level of interest in the Senate as you have in Latin America?
I do, and I'd say on a very bipartisan basis. The trip that you mentioned that I took down to Chile, to Uruguay, I went with our Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman, Bob Menendez, and Senator Kane. Both from the Democrat Party. I'm a Republican, but we see the issues and the opportunities, I think, in a very aligned fashion. And what we all want to see in the United States Senate is a deeper cooperation and deeper ties between our two nations. Again, as a business person, I look at it through an economic lens. I think that's the most critical step that we can take, and it's the greatest and most obvious opportunity for us, is to work on economic ties and prosperity for our nation. If we can share economic prosperity, we can share our security interest as well, and it'd be good for all of us.
Well, we totally agree with that here at the Council of the Americas, and we want to work with you, the U.S. government, and anybody else that's interested in really building ties and dialogue across the hemisphere. The opportunity is enormous,
Indeed.
and we thank you for your commitment, and we thank you for being here today.
Susan, thank you for your leadership, and thanks to all of you. So many of my friends in the audience here, I appreciate what you do, and as someone who served as a diplomat in the past, I understand the challenges. Your country is counting on you. You're the very top diplomat if you're sitting in this room right now, and I very much appreciate everything that you do and the friendship and the partnership that you've presented.
Thank you again. It was great. Thank you.